Okay, great. It's lovely to see so many people. So tonight is the last in the series, looking at Four Lineages. But before we have that talk, let's have a short meditation, just to help us arrive here and settle. Okay? So I can't quite believe we've come to the last of this series. These four different lineages. I've really enjoyed the last few weeks, particularly sort of having some speakers here who, we don't hear that regularly. So that's been lovely. So, come to the last lineage. The last 3 weeks we've been exploring the legacy of Sangharakshita through exploring these four lineages. These four lineages that he's passed down to us. And I was thinking, in a way, they're like four collections, four treasures of the Dharma, if you like, that over Sangharakshita's lifetime he sort of gathered together and packaged for us, and it was like tied a bow on the top of it. He's handed them down to us, these lineages. You could also say that he's sort of distilled through his practice and reflection. He's tried to distill the essence of the Dharma and tried to communicate that in a way that's accessible to us, so that we can put the Dharma into effect, as it were. So I'll just recap. So we've had these three previous lineages. We had Padmajata, who spoke of the lives of Buddhist figures that sort of enliven and energize and motivate our practice. Figures that are both historical and archetypal. Figures that we can resonate with, be inspired by. They show the way, they exemplify the ideal. Whether they're historical or archetypal figures. So I enjoyed Padmajata's evocation of those figures. And then we had Sangadevi talking about the lineages of institutions and responsibilities. I really enjoyed that talk, just hearing of her experience of how, as it were, taking on and engaging with those responsibilities changed her, and also created this collective environment in which we can practice. So those supportive structures and that, they almost like they hold us. I feel they hold us and carry forward our intentions, both individual and collective. So then last week we had Priyananda, and he really talked about teachings. So in a way he talked about the framework of ideas and understandings that point us in the right direction, really. They present the Buddhist path, and they present an enlightened perspective. And again, I really enjoyed Priyananda's talk. He conjured up the image of a great oak tree as the teachings that revolve with the Dharma. And particularly he talked about the trunk, the very trunk and roots maybe, going back to the Buddha himself. But all these branches have grown, and sometimes they've ended. We've lost those traditions, but new ones have grown up. So I enjoyed that. So tonight I'm going to be looking at the lineage of practices. I'll say something a little bit more about lineages in general. So these four lineages are offered as something we can participate in, we can creatively engage with, we can live within in a way, and even pass on. So there's something not just to observe, but actually to engage with. And these four lineages, in a way, form the living tradition that is Triratna, I would say, the Triratna community. They provide the means by which we can follow the spiritual path together. They present the possibility of a commonly held and understood set of ideals, teachings and practices and structures that we can share together. But in a way, for any lineage to be of any benefit, it must be alive, it must be active, it must be in people's experience and connected with, both for the individuals involved and in a collective way. So I think, I just want to make the point that I think these lineages can only flourish within a community, based on friendship, when they become the sort of medium of communication, they become the reference points, the means by which the community remains vital. And I was also thinking and reflecting a bit about lineage in general, that in different Buddhist traditions, lineage, it takes on a different importance, a different meaning and significance. So I remember talking about this with someone from a different tradition, someone from within one of the Tibetan traditions. And within that tradition, the purity of an unbroken lineage of teachers is seen as paramount. I hadn't quite got that until I had this conversation. So for the teachings and practices to be effective, to be passed on from generation, there's an emphasis on the guru-disciple relationship. That's really seen as important, that there's an unbroken chain from teacher to teacher to teacher, teacher to disciple, and then teacher to disciple. So if any teacher in that chain is revealed not to be genuine in some way, that undermines the whole chain. It's very important within that tradition. So the validity of a particular school depends on having this unbroken lineage of teachers. So while very much respecting the the Tibetan tradition, Triratna does not base the validity of its teaching, of its lineage, in the same way. In some sense, I think, we rather look to the kind of criteria that the Buddha gave to Mahaprajapati. So you may know Mahaprajapati was the maiden aunt of the Buddha and a fellow wanderer. And she asked him about, how do we know what the Dharma is? So in this famous discourse, the Buddha pointed to the way that she herself can judge the effectiveness of the teaching. She can test it out, as it were, there's various conditions. For example, the Buddha said that the Dharma leads to dispassion, not to agitation. It leads to contentment, not to discontent. It needs to letting go rather than accumulation. So he gave a list of things whereby Mahaprajapati could actually test out and check the teachings in her own experience. She could reference the effectiveness of a teaching in her own experience. However, that does not mean that in Triratna that the guidance of lineage is unimportant. Yeah, that would be maybe going to the other extreme of the Tibetan tradition. That position might be to say, well, we can contact all the teachings and practices. They're all online. You can go out and find all these things online. You just have to, click and you can find them. So why don't we just choose our own teachings, our own path? That's the other extreme to saying that the validity is only on this line of teachers. So in a way, I was thinking that Triratna, in a way, attempts to take something of a middle way between these two, what I might call extremes. Triratna offers a coherent set of teachings and practices that work together. Yeah, they work with each other. They had offered within a framework of a progressive set of steps towards deeper level of practice and understanding. So Sangharakshita has drawn from teachings and practices from the whole Buddhist tradition and through Buddhist history. But he's based what he's taught on spiritual principles rooted in early Buddhism. So he's elucidated a set of teachings and practices that work together and mutually support each other. These practices have both been tested in Sangharakshita's own practice, his own spiritual practice over many years, and also his careful observation of his followers, how they've got on with them. So it's on this basis that he provided guidance. So in a way, this middle way also allows for a certain adjustment to the temperament of the individual and where they are on the spiritual path. So as I say, today the practice offered by Triratna are presented within the context of a community where we can gain some support and guidance and encouragement from a range of teachers, not any one particular teachers. We can benefit from people, I benefit from people who've been practicing within our tradition for a long time. And I might go to different people when I want to know or have a question about a different aspect of the teaching or practice. So that's a bit more how Triratna works. And each of us, it still leaves each of us responsible for our own inspiration and our own choice of how we practice. Yeah. We're responsible for our own practice in a way. That's what I'm saying. Okay, maybe that's enough about lineage. Keep an eye on the time. So what do we mean? What do we mean by the lineage of practice? What do we mean by practice? So maybe we just need to address that. So here we can pick up on what Priyananda was talking about last week. The first of his three main teachings that he mentioned was conditionality, or conditioned arising. That all things arise in dependence upon conditions. And also that there's both a cyclic or reactive conditionality, that of repetitive habit, but there's the alternative of spiral conditionality. That, for example, is where positive mental state conditions and augments an even higher or even more refined mental state, a more elevated mental state. So there's this more spiral conditionality to more and more positive mental states. So on that basis, you could say the Buddhist practice is an application, a training, an effort by various means and methods to create conditions for ever more positive mental states. That's what we practice for, to bring about more positive mental states, and also the qualities of wisdom and compassion and all those other rich qualities that arise out of those positive mental states. I suppose I also think it's important to consider when we talk about practices, we're not just talking about methods or techniques. Also we need to consider not just what practices we take on, but also how we approach them. That's really important, how we approach them. If we were doing the metta bhavana in a forceful way, well, that's not really going to work. We need to bring kindness to whatever is there, whatever arises in our experience. So how we approach practices is really important too. And also why. The context of the Buddhist vision of awakening is important too. So all these aspects influence one another. They're all part of what we mean by Buddhist practice. So, what's involved in Triratna's lineage of practices? Well, as I say, within the Buddhist tradition, there's so many different practices, so many approaches to working directly with the mind. How do we make sense of all these, and what practices are effective? Which practices will help us to grow and develop at this stage in our spiritual lives? So these are the kind of questions that Sangharakshita attempted to address as he started a new Buddhist movement back in the 60s. So, it's worth saying that Sangharakshita looked at practice from a very broad point of view, as well as formal meditation, which obviously takes a central role within Triratna practice. He encouraged people to take up mindfulness in everyday life, And he talked about his own practice and struggles and challenges with mindfulness. Although to me they seem incredibly elevated. So he thought of living a Dharma life is much, much more than just meditation, both on and off the cushion. We're going to work it with our minds in lots of ways. He also put quite a strong emphasis on Dharma study, including personal reflection and collective group study. That is a central feature within our tradition. Yeah. And he also talked about the practice of community, that actually actively contributing to the community that helps other people, that we support each other. So this aspect of collective practice was really important. As I mentioned earlier, Sangadevi spoke very well of how taking on a project like fundraising and establishing a retreat centre like Taraloka, well, she really benefited from that, but it also benefited thousands of women over the past few decades. Bhante gave a strong emphasis to spiritual friendship, to really trying to deepen and take friendship deeper. So I could go on, I could list all the different practices, but I'm not sure how helpful that would be. So what I wanted to do actually for the rest of this talk is talk about something called a system of practice. So it's a way of looking at practices and seeing how they work together. Yeah. So as I said, through personal experience, through observation and intuitive grasp, Sangharakshita saw that this system of practice, these sort of 5 stages or aspects or even say modalities, cover the way any spiritual life unfolds, the sort of stages or aspects that it needs to pass through. So he put forward that all practices can be categorized in one or more of these stages. So what are these? So, let's have a look. So yes, we're going to look at system of practice. So, not quite Sadharaja, but no, he's my something to live up to there. So, the system of practice. So, I'm going to say a bit about each of these 5. Integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, and then around these I've got spiritual receptivity. So some of you will be familiar with these. So I'm going to have a look at them first in this sort of progressive way, but then I'll say a bit more. So integration. So I think we're probably fairly familiar with some of this, but the stage of integration acknowledges that we arrive on the spiritual path. Well, I certainly did, a conflicting but a bundle of desires, energies, inclinations, even sort of different selves. And often these different tendencies are pulling in different directions. We might want to meditate, but we get caught up in the next episode of that detective series, or even the whole box set, So we're there at late at night, and we don't get up in the morning to meditate, even though we want to. We know that a friend is having a bit of a tough time, but we get distracted and we don't actually get to ring them up, which is a shame. So the practice of mindfulness, in particularly the practice of mindfulness of breathing, helps us begin to be aware of these different drives in our experience. We begin to see the tendencies which are often unconscious. We see those habits working out. We observe them really. And gradually we can bring more and more of ourselves into awareness, becoming more familiar with our tendencies. In a way, we can begin to befriend our tendencies, even those tendencies we don't really like so much. We can get into dialogue with them. bring kindness to bear. And then with effort, we can begin maybe to help to let go of unhelpful habits and support more positive habits. We can begin to align these different drives around some sort of higher principle. I think that's an important aspect of integration. There needs to be some sort of higher principle. And with application in this way, we can begin to experience ourselves as more whole. Our life becomes more orientated around our ideals. What has deeper meaning for us, the value and importance. And with that, we can experience more unity and harmony within ourselves. Another aspect of this integration is it leads to more consistent and focused sense of agency. We gain some sort of self-mastery with ourselves. And this in turn allows us to commit ourselves. In particular, we can commit ourselves to what is meaningful. We can commit ourselves to the spiritual path. So all this process we're calling integration. Something that can be developed progressively, starting in small ways, and then with growing awareness, including more and more of ourselves, our breadth and the depth of our being. So a little example here I was thinking of is vegetarianism. So for me, initially this practice required quite a bit of effort. But then after a time, it sort of just became quite natural. In a way, it became part of me. Yeah, it was quite natural, and the idea of eating meat just holds no attraction now. I have to confess that I'm not quite a vegan yet. Still a bit of hard work with cheese. But so the Buddha talks about this. He talks about mala and pala. So he talks about the path and the fruit. So when we practice, in time it becomes part of us. We embody it, and that's really what integration is about. We begin to embody what we practice. It becomes part of us. Our practice becomes integrated into who we are. So as I'll say a bit more later, the integration can happen in deeper and deeper levels. So far, maybe I've been describing at a more psychological level, but that can go deeper and deeper. And I'd say that true spiritual integration can only really take place when we orientate ourselves around a transcendental ideal. So I'm saying we need ultimately to orientate ourselves around a transcendental ideal. And by that I mean we orientate ourselves to something which is beyond, that goes beyond our current experience, our common understanding, but we intuitively feel drawn to that. Yeah. Say more about that, but I'll leave that there. So before moving on from this stage of integration, it's worth mentioning practices associated with this stage. So, as I say, it's not just meditation, but I've personally found self-reflection, collective study and friendship all help me, are powerful drivers in sort of seeing myself more clearly and coming to more of a psychic wholeness. Seeing myself reflected back by others enables me to become more aware and integrate the different parts of myself. So integration is also inextricably connected with individuality. So what I mean by that is a sense of agency. We develop with integration a sense of agency that isn't so much influenced by others, by the group. We're guided more by an inner awareness and identification of what's important to us, our own spiritual goals and direction. Also, this individuality obviously does help, enables others to trust and have more confidence in us. Okay, so that's quite a bit about integration. So we better move on. Positive emotion. Within developing positive emotion, metta bhavana obviously plays a very important, essential part. Also, the 6 sister practices of dwelling in delight, developing compassion and equanimity, what we call the Brahma Viharas. So in this stage of developing positive emotion, we start by bringing a receptivity to our emotional lives. We develop an open-heartedness, a kindness towards ourselves and others. We can bring the mindfulness that we developed within the stage of integration within the context of our emotional life. And again, we begin to notice our habitual emotional responses to ourselves, the world, to others. And we attempt to stay in that gap between an initial feeling, we sometimes call Vedana, whether something is pleasant, unpleasant or neutral, but the gap between that and our habitual responses. And opening up that gap, we learn more that we can restrain unskillful actions and cultivate more creative emotional responses and behaviour. So within this stage of developing positive emotion, we also need to include an awareness of Buddhist ethical principles, the 5 precepts, for example. Through keeping these in mind, this helps us to refine our ethical sensitivity and alerting us to actual potential and actual skillful and unskillful behaviour. For me, I remember my early days working in team-based right livelihood, way back in my 20s when I worked for Windhorse Evolution, were a time when I remember becoming more and more aware of the effect of my mental states, both on myself and others. That environment, working with others, seeing the effects of my own mental states and having them reflected back, really brought home to me this thing of actions having consequences. It really brought home an appreciation that positive mental states are not just incidental, but they're the result of acting skillfully, the result of becoming more aware, bringing care and concern for others. So these and other practices engage our emotional energies, our emotional desires, and they can direct them more to our personal and others' well-being. We become more unified. We begin to refine and integrate our mental states. We develop stronger and more refined emotional sensibilities. Maybe we become a bit more attuned to the beauty, even moral beauty of others. So this doesn't mean, I think with this stage of positive emotion, it doesn't mean we're necessarily happy all the time. Sorry to say, but it doesn't. But what it does mean is, my experience is, I experience more deeper, stronger emotion, or emotions more deeply, more fully, as it were. So, and more the joys, as it were, of others and myself, and the sorrows, as it were. I feel them a bit more deeply, particularly when I've been practicing the metta bhavana consistently. So before moving on from positive emotion, I want to also mention Shraddha and practices which evoke Shraddha. Shraddha is a really important emotion. It's the confidence we have, a sort of faith or response of, a natural response of to value, to higher value. And obviously ritual and devotion is one way that we can develop that Shraddha, that positive emotion towards engaging and moving ourselves along the path. Yeah, I just want to end by noting, I was reading a little bit about Sangharakshita's engagement with the metta bhavana. He didn't start right at the beginning of his Buddhist life practicing the metta bhavana. I think for quite a long time he was just doing the mindfulness of breathing. He'd heard about the metta bhavana. But there was a point, he said, when he realised this was important. And he started to engage with it, and he just realised how important a practice it was. And then particularly when he came to the West, he saw, yes, it's a really important practice. It's really needed. So I found that interesting, just reading a little bit about that process of how he came to really value these positive emotion practices. Okay, so moving on to, I'll be saying a little bit less about as we go on to these other practices. So spiritual death, or maybe letting go. I think sometimes this label spiritual death can be a bit misleading, and maybe letting go can be a bit of a better title. So to be clear, spiritual death does not mean the death of anything real. In a way, it's more about letting go of that which we imagine to be real, letting go of what we take to be real, that we've invested in as being permanent, but it isn't. In a way, this practice is about the death of illusion, or the death of ignorance, letting go of those things. So in a way, this practice here is about becoming more and more familiar with the core teachings of the Dharma. Not in any purely intellectual way, but we need to see the principles of the Dharma as they are presented within our own lives. Yeah. So maybe just as an example, key among these principles is the truth of impermanence. Yeah. That everything is in a continual state of flux or change. So spiritual death is really seeing this impermanence, seeing that because we don't really take it fully on board, we suffer. We take things to be permanent when they're not. So we need to be seeing and letting go of those ideas, letting go of our attachment to the way we might relate to people. So I'll give you an example here that's current for me, or it's been evolving really over the last year, I suppose. What I realise is maybe my psychological tendency is to look ahead and to sort of orientate myself to the future, particularly looking forward to a holiday, or I'm looking forward to seeing so-and-so, looking forward to doing this. Now, in a way, that's okay as far as it goes, but I realised it was sort of orientating myself to the future and an attractive, what I set up as an attractive, enjoyable experience that I'd have in the future. But it tended to take me out of the present, being in the present, and to view the present as being, it's a bit boring, isn't it? I'm just kind of living through this to get to this future positive or pleasurable experience. So I've been trying to let that go and almost like live in the slightly boring now. So like living with that sort of sense of boredom a little bit. It's kind of interesting. I think I'm getting somewhere. Initially it felt like, I don't want to let go of that. Let go of looking forward. But anyway, maybe that gives you an idea. So we can explore this letting go, the spiritual death, in lots of different areas. It's just, it's not just about this sort of, not impermanence. But ultimately, this stage is about letting go of the idea that we have a fixed, unchanging self, and that this fixed, unchanging self is having an experience of a world out there that's totally separate from us, totally not us. So fixed in here and something different, separate from us out there. So the Dharma says things are not quite like that. So one of the practices that I've found begins to chip away at this is the six element practice, in which we examine the different experiences of earth, solidity, the fluidity of water, the flow of air, and so on. And we see that our identification with those cannot be more than provisional, really. We are not the elements. They are not us. We certainly can't say that we hold on to these elements. They're passing through our bodies all the time. So this can be quite a challenging practice, but it can also be remarkably freeing at times as well. Importantly, this kind of practice needs to be taken on a basis of a stable and positive self-regard, and I also think maybe guided by someone who has more experience of that practice. In a way, with this practice, we could start with something simpler and maybe just as challenging in a way, and that's the practice of giving. Recognizing that there are other folk out there, there are other people with needs, same needs as us, and just attending to that and being generous, attending to other people's needs. This allows us to start, at least to soften that very hard sense of self that we have. Okay, I need to be attending to the time. So spiritual rebirth. Well, spiritual rebirth follows on from this letting go, this spiritual death. It could be said that it's just the other side of the same coin of letting go. Letting go of a fixed sense of self releases energy. It allows the possibility of creative qualities, even a new way of being, to emerge. So spiritual rebirth arises when we orientate ourselves to what is of deeper value. We open up maybe to what is of the highest value, the qualities of awakening. It comes about when there's a resonance between what we respond to out there, which is of value to us, maybe beauty of nature or art, or we might respond to the moral action, the heroism, say, of another person. And we respond to that because it resonates with something in us, some potential in us, some latent quality that we can draw out of ourselves. So in a way, this is, I think, the sort of basis of spiritual rebirth. Within this stage, developing imagination, I think, particularly becomes important. We respond more strongly to an image than an idea. We respond to stories. And these can connect us with the qualities of enlightenment, the qualities of awakening. And particularly the kind of archetypal and historical figures that inspire and embody the ideal. They're exemplars of the ideal, as Padmajata elucidated a few weeks ago. So recollecting the Buddha, Priyananda talked about Pingya, the monk who recollected the Buddha, and through his recollection he felt in the presence of the Buddha, and he felt guided by the Buddha just through his imagination, through his recollection of the Buddha. So that's spiritual rebirth. Spiritual receptivity. So as we progress, as it were, through these stages, it becomes more and more difficult to really pin down these practices. And that's even more so maybe with spiritual receptivity. In a way, spiritual receptivity represents a different kind of practice than the other stages in the system. In a way, it's a practice of non-practice. That sounds deep, doesn't it? A practice of non-present practice. It's more, in a way, a quality or approach that we need to bring to all the other stages. That's why I've drawn it around the other stages. In a way, I think we need an element of spiritual receptivity for the other stages to be effective. We somehow need to leave the space around the other practices for something new to emerge, for a different kind of consciousness to emerge, something creative to emerge, a different way of being. Without that, if we practice too tightly and too forcefully the other practices, we'll maybe just be rearranging our psyche in one way or another. So spiritual receptivity, with spiritual receptivity, well, this is something Vasantra talks about. He say it's about leaving the ego project behind, that continual process of selfing, whereby we're constantly referring our experience back to ourself, back to our imagined self. So in this stage, we're trying to move beyond this self-willing. It's quite subtle in a way, and quite mysterious. Now, the main practice within this stage, we could say, is just sitting. So this is where we allow the mind to be open and relaxed. We open up with patience to what is unfolding within our experience. There's no particular focus of concentration within this practice. And if we can successfully allow this opening approach, then all sorts of spiritual qualities and inspiration can arise. Now, I'm very aware of the time, so I'm not going to say much about just sitting. If you want to know a bit more about just sitting, you can listen to Subhuti on Free Buddhist Audio. He talks about, how many is it? 5 different kinds of just sitting. So there's a whole talk in that. But what I will say is, there's a kind of just sitting at the end of a practice. You know, we do that a little bit. But if you're meditating at home and you're meditating for 20 minutes, 25 minutes, leave 5 minutes, at least 5 minutes at the end, where you built up a momentum possibly in the practice. There's a directionality to your concentration and attention. We'll just try to let go of that effort and try and sit in that unfolding. And often it's there when something different arises. That's what I find. For me, when I sit, I like sitting when we meditate together and just listening to all the sounds as other people get up and go at the end of a meditation. Sometimes I get really concentrated then, when I'm not making an effort. Yeah. Okay, one last thing I wanted to say about spiritual receptivity, and that's the practice of doing nothing. I was saying in the team before we started, I'm just about to go on solitary. I'm going to go on solitary, and I'm going to practice doing nothing. It's really difficult to do nothing. Have you tried practicing? I was confessing that last year I went to Kukuloka. I went on a 3-week solitary, and a few days into the solitary, I found myself making a gravel patio at the front of the hut. How did that happen? I somehow, anyway, I won't go into details, but anyway, I limited myself to just doing it for no more than half an hour a day, and I finished that project. But it's so easy to fall into projects. We define ourselves in terms of projects. Life is a project, isn't it? So just try to sit and not even do meditation. Just sit. Sometimes I can get into that. Sometimes I find myself doing little jobs. So just to finish off, in a way I've presented these 5 stages or aspects of practice within a progressive sequence. And just to say, it's not that you complete integration and then you move on to positive emotion. In a way we spiral through these. We need to go back. It may be that we attain some sort of psychological integration, and that helps us to commit ourselves to the spiritual path, develop more positive emotion. But as we get up here, we realise possibly that we're hanging on to things, and we need to go back and integrate the new learnings from up here into our practice. So we cycle through these again and again in our practice. But also, you can see these 5 aspects. I was going to say in a mandala. It's not a very pretty picture of a mandala, but hopefully you get some idea. Or maybe you can imagine to connect with like a lotus or something, that these different aspects are petals of a lotus. And what that helps, for me, it helps me to locate myself where I am in my practice, and what I need. So it may be I've been practicing mindfulness of breathing a lot, and I realise, I've got a bit dry in my practice and lost a bit of a sense of energy or engagement. So maybe I need to move over here to do more positive emotion practices. And also this sort of indicates that all of these practices need some element of receptivity is really important, just leaving space. So, lastly, I just say that, I don't want to give the impression that this sort of, to talk about a system of practice, it can sound like something imposed from at the head and ideas. But my sense, reading how Sangharakshita developed this, in a way he adapted and modified something that was there within the Buddhist tradition, but modified it in a way which I think is very accessible. But what I think he intuited is these elements are, they're natural, they're organic. It's an organic system that arises out of the kind of mental states, the kind of approaches we need to go through to develop spiritually. They're not the possession, I think, of Buddhists or the Buddhist part. I think you could look at these with regard to any spiritual tradition. In fact, I'm not going to talk about this, but if you want a good book to read, lastly I read George Eliot's Romola. Anybody read that book? Yeah? Margavir's read it. It's a very good book. But in that book, the heroine follows a spiritual journey in the story. And what I realised reading it last year, that she traverses all these different aspects and stages in her spiritual journey. Very interesting, very interesting. Anyway, we haven't got time for that. Okay, I'll leave it there. Sorry if I went over a little bit, but it's tea break time, and then after tea break we'll get into groups and we can explore some questions around this.